Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So the brain is an organ. It's the same as the heart, the lungs, the stomach, whatever. And today we know that our consciousness is somehow, we don't know specifically, I don't think, but somehow made up of electrical currents and chemicals reacting in our gray matter. I don't know why it always does that, but it always disconnects right in the middle, or right in the first paragraph of the sermon. Why do you do that? Have you noticed? Like every week, at the exact same time. Anyway. So the brain sends signals to our muscles, our nerves send signals back from our senses, and then other chemicals get shuttled back and forth like endorphins and hormones, forming our experience of the world. This is the physical manifestation of our consciousness in this bodily organ we call the brain. So what happens to our consciousness when the brain doesn't do what it's supposed to do? Just like our stomach or muscles might not do. Should we even be saying supposed to do, given the fact that nature is ever changing and adapting? What happens if it produces a sad chemical when it's supposed to produce a happy chemical? What happens when the chemicals that make up our memories are a little different than they would be otherwise? Or if the wrong electrical signal mixes with the wrong chemical? I don't know quite how all this works. So I'm probably making some mistakes here, but what happens when that doesn't work right? If it was with our stomach or our leg, we'd understand. We'd go to the doctor, we'd get it fixed. But if it's with our brain, we think that's somehow different. I hadn't thought about it this way until just this week, actually. But mental health is physical health. Your brain is no less physical than your lung or your ear. If it has a physical problem, then you are going to experience the world differently. I never thought about that. Mental health problems are physical health problems. So why do we treat mental health differently than physical health? Let's add a further layer of complexity to this, because brain physical health aside, the world can still be very confusing. Perhaps we've experienced a trauma, and we're now experiencing the world from a more defensive position than we would have. Perhaps something is happening that we just don't understand. The world's not adding up. Perhaps we've even taken on a philosophy that does not jive with the way the world's actually working. This one's really big right now because everyone's latching on to a philosophy and looking at magazines and social media, and we're getting a different view of the world than is the reality. And my understanding is that on top of just the general confusion that all these things can cause, they do actually change the chemicals and the reactions in your brain. They can cause physical change. So not only can these be mental challenges, for lack of a better term, they can turn into physical changes as well. So again, I ask, why do we treat mental health with such a stigma when there are so many varied causes that have nothing to do with who we are as a person? I've got a few theories. For one, modern psychology as we know it is pretty new as far as a discipline. Does anybody know when this fella died, Sigmund Freud died? Does anybody want to guess? Because I'll bet you it's sooner than you think. I hear some rumbling. Anyone want to guess? George?
I'm just guessing, obviously. 1900s, maybe first third of the 1900s.
First third of the 1900s. Okay, I thought I heard something over here too. Did I hear 1950s? No? Okay, 1939. I don't know about you, but when I think of Freud, I think way back. But 1939 is not that long ago. And he and his contemporaries were trailblazers. At that time, like I said, psychology was pretty barbaric. Freud boiled everything down to sex. Lobotomies and shock therapy were commonplace. Institutionalization was the typical way we dealt with mental health until well into the 60s. In fact, if Kathy were here, she'd probably tell us even sooner. In other words, we hid it. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Has anybody read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? A few of you? I read it in high school. I thought it was a great book. I really liked it. But One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was written in 1959 and published in 1962. And portrayed a pretty barbaric time, a very different time than what we're experiencing today. And it wasn't until after this that the modern mental health movement was born. This is where the roots are, but like we're talking the 60s and 70s. That's not long ago. Another way to think about it, why we stigmatize mental health, is how we think of our consciousness. That's why I had you thinking about that. Where does your consciousness reside? It's still an abstract thought, but we know that our consciousness somehow exists within the gray matter through chemicals and electrical signals. And prior to that, which may only be 50 years ago, it was far more nebulous. If something was wrong mentally, then there's a good chance we thought it was just you. Right? If you separate the physical from our consciousness, and it's not a physical problem, then maybe it's just you. I don't think there's this sense of a link between your physical body and your consciousness for a lot of human history like there is today. And that means that if you had a health issue, it might just be you. Our Bible story today illustrates this, I think, in a really surprising and modern way. Jesus and the disciples have gone across the Sea of Galilee and found a man with what the NIV calls an impure spirit. I think in the passage it said lake, but they flip back and forth between Sea of Galilee and Lake of Tiberias. It's the same thing. And let's just take stock of this man for a minute. He was living in the tombs. In other words, his community had rejected him. He was violent because nobody could tie him up anymore. He'd gone through a trauma because his community was trying to tie him up. Imagine that. If your community had to tie you down, how traumatic that would be. And he spent his time yelling and cutting himself. He was self-harming. And then, after getting whatever the man had, they called it a demon, we probably wouldn't call it that today, the pigs ran off a cliff. I mean, it's a strange story, but the pigs committed suicide after they left the man, after the demon left the man. The affliction, whatever it was, caused suicidal thoughts. So this man's community had given up on him. He probably had something like PTSD from being tied up, apparently several times. He was self-harming and likely suicidal. This is clearly, by today's standards, a significant mental health issue, and his community dealt with it extremely poorly, likely compounding the issue. In early pre-scientific days, the first century, they had no explanation. What language did they have other than saying, oh, he's got a demon? We still use that language surprisingly often. And he had no visible physical issue. So it must have just been him, and he was clearly dangerous, is how they would have viewed it. The community chose the safe and easy route. Give up on him. Cut him off. Now, the beauty of being Jesus is that he understood immediately and had the ability to help him. We're just figuring this out now. Jesus would have seen it and understood. Hanging around with Jesus in those days was kind of like having modern universal health care. He just healed people and did so readily. You didn't have to pay him. He just healed you. So that man went from being an outcast howling at the moon in the cemetery to the first missionary to the Gentiles. A position that he was uniquely equipped to do because he knew what it meant to be outcast, and he knew what it meant to be loved and believed in despite being outcast. What I think is really beautiful about this story is that it addresses both the man's physical and emotional needs. Jesus physically healed him, took care of the physical side, but surely he had significant emotional problems. I'm not sure what the proper term is, from his community first tying him up and then casting him out completely. And we know that this was not a welcoming community because they were more concerned about their pigs than the miraculous healing of their compatriot. I think we can understand that if a farmer's whole livelihood marches off a cliff, that's a bad thing. We'd hope they'd be happier. They'd at least be happy about this healing, but they weren't. The gospel message in this story is that Jesus chose the vulnerable man to be the leader. Obviously, this man had been dangerous. The community chose safety and strength because they were afraid. But the man Jesus chose to bring the gospel message through to them was the one who had been cast out. The one who genuinely suffered, felt rejection, and later felt redeeming love. None of the others in this community could have been the first missionary to the Gentiles. They had chosen strength. But this man could only be the leader because he had been weak. My point this week is that we are not our problems. And if we are not our problems, then we should be able to talk openly about them. What I think is amazing is Jesus knew this 2 millennia ago. We're just getting the empirical evidence to believe it today, in the last 50 years. We should have known better. We've obviously been told this for 2,000 years, but we don't. Today, there's no more excuse. We know that healing is possible. We know that whatever you're facing is not you. You may be shaped by your challenges, but that makes you stronger. That makes you able to be a leader in a healing community. The goal, therefore, must be creating a community where you can be vulnerable. A community that values talking about what makes us vulnerable so that it's out there. A community that creates an environment where we can feel safe and comfortable enough to be genuinely vulnerable. A community that finds strength in vulnerability so that we are stronger because we're supporting each other. in being who God created us.